in my experience, veterans, who were potentially culpable or, who served as agents of trauma or violence on others, for reasons that maybe really were juxtaposed to the rules of engagement, that when they seek treatment, they don't want somebody who's going to explain away their actions. They want somebody who's going to help them to take responsibility and to really come to terms. So in a way, it's akin to a process of confession. That they want somebody, who's not going to, for lack of a better word, absolve their sins too quickly. They want to own them. They want to take responsibility for them.
When a civilian enters any branch of the military, they go through a period of basic military training that's designed to change the way they think and act to turn them into a soldier, sailor, Marine, airman, or Coast Guardsman.
Hard work, hard work. Hard work, hard work. Hard work.
This is seen as an important time in the individual's life, critical for the proper transition from being someone not in the military to part of one of the greatest fighting forces on the planet.
Earn my pay. Hard work, hard work, do it every day. Hard work, get up out of 2:45. Hard work.
After a period of time in the military, however, there's little done in any branch of the service to help that service member transition their mindset to life as a veteran.
Hard work, that's what they say. Hard work, I earn my pay. Hard work.
As we often say here in the Change Your POV podcast network, after one leaves the military, they're never going to be a civilian again. And they're no longer a service member. They're this entirely different third thing, a veteran, with all the experiences, knowledge, strengths, and challenges that go along with that word.
Hard work, manifest. Hard work, you gotta do it right. Hard work.
One of the most overlooked aspects of transition is a service member's mental health and wellness. If the veteran has their heart, mind, body, and spirit in the right place, and has a support network of family and friends to rely upon, then they're most likely going to have a successful transition. If those things are not in place, things can get challenging.
Hard work, in the early morning rain. Hard work, that's what they say. Hard work.
I'm your host, Dwayne France, and I'm going to take you through a veteran mental health boot camp to give you some advanced training for your brain.
Fired up. Hard work, everybody on the plane. Hard work, sit 'em on down. Hard work.
These episodes will cover the many different aspects of veteran mental health that I, as both a combat veteran and a clinical mental health counselor, see, experience, and support veterans with daily.
Hard work, I earn my pay. Hard work, hard work.
I'm going to be joined by both veterans and mental health professionals talking about what you need to know about the stigma against seeking support, the different areas we need to understand, and provide some resources for when you think you might need them.
That's what they say. Hard work, earn my pay. Hard work, do it every day.
Get up in the morning and out of the rack, because this is some information that could very well save your life. Welcome to Veteran Mental Health Boot Camp. Hey everybody, welcome back to the Headspace and Timing podcast. As you know, we're in the middle of this series looking at veteran mental health that's going beyond just PTSD and TBI. And we started this about 5 or 6 episodes ago. And as I'd mentioned there, definitely we talked about PTSD and TBI with Dr. Mary Catherine and Marissa Brandt. And we've had these conversations about what people think veteran mental health is, but now we've started to go beyond what people typically think about when they come to veteran mental health. And so our guest today is Dr. Joseph Currier, and he is one of the leading experts and researchers on the concept of moral injury. And this idea of moral injury is something that has started to emerge, I think, in the last 10 or 15 years as something kin to or like PTSD, but also something very different. So I'd really looking forward to this conversation with Joe, and we'll go ahead and get started. Joe, welcome.
Thank you. I'm glad to be here.
Yeah, no problem. I mean, I'm really glad that you took the time to share your knowledge and share your research and everything that you've come to understand. So before we get started into moral injury, I'd like to have you tell the audience a little bit more about yourself, sort of where you're at right now and what you're doing.
Yeah, so I'm currently an assistant professor and the director of clinical training for the Clinical and Counseling Psychology doctoral program at the University of South Alabama. Prior to coming here to USA, I've spent about 8 to 10 years, working with veterans in various capacities as a clinician and a researcher. I had the great fortune, like many clinical psychologists, to complete my residency and fellowship training at a VA medical center, and it was really in those experiences around 2007, 8, 9, when the second and third waves of veterans were coming back from the campaigns in Iraq and Afghanistan, and I was a therapist who was put in the position to help them to heal and to recover and to restore meaning and relationship in life. And it was really those encounters that captured my heart for helping this population and really began to make me ask questions about ways to more effectively support veteran mental health.
So that's really great. Did you anticipate that you were going to work with veterans? Was your placement in the VA something that you searched out, or were you kind of surprised that this was an aspect of clinical psychology you fell into?
I guess I would probably answer that question both and. I have long been interested in the topic of trauma. I've long been interested in existential spiritual dimensions of trauma adjustment. And when I got about halfway through my PhD training, I also wanted to pursue work that would respond to the needs of society. And I happened to go through my PhD training a couple years after we launched into the ground combat operations in Iraq and Afghanistan. So I had the fortune of doing a practicum at the Memphis VA Medical Center, and I worked with the Ptsd clinical team there for about a year and a half. And it was about 3 or 4 months into that practicum training that I began to think really seriously about specializing in veteran mental health for my career. That was not something that I had anticipated when I started my PhD training, but it emerged probably about halfway through. And thankfully, I haven't needed to veer away from that.
Yes, unfortunately, it is a booming business, as I always say, and I imagine you probably do. Would be great if we got to a point where we weren't needed, but we absolutely are right now.
Absolutely. And it's important to me. I think, like many of us, I really enjoy being needed, although I would covet the day where maybe we don't need people like me to be working so hard. Yeah.
Now, and that's something, and you mentioned existential aspects, existential psychology. That was actually a discussion I had on the previous episode with Dr. Aaron James Smith, that existentialism, purpose and meaning, that's something that, in my experience, and I mentioned this on that episode with him, is in the veterans that I work with, that's a majority of, and I would say almost completely, an issue that many veterans are wanting to talk about, where not all of them want to deal with PTSD or TBI, but many veterans, if not all veterans that I talk to, really have questions around what is my life like after the military, how do I find purpose and meaning, and that's something that mental health professionals, especially with a background in existential psychology, Irvin Yalom, Rollo May, Viktor Frankl, of course, has a lot to be able to contribute to veterans in that space.
Absolutely.
Now, a lot of the work that you do, and the reason that I reached out to you even before this podcast, was your work on moral injury, and moral injury is similar to, which is one of the reasons why I made sure that these episodes were closely together. It's tied to existentialism, I think, in many ways, but it is a separate construct, and so. I guess I'd like to start out my sort of description of moral injury, how I describe it to my veterans, or how I've talked about it on the show and my blogs before, but then go into what you understand. So
Sure, absolutely.
I explain when I talk about this, I say that PTSD is an injury of the behavior. That's a very simplistic thing, of course, but the automatic fear response, the loud noise, and I have this neurological, physiological, behavioral response. Traumatic brain injury is an injury of the brain, a physical injury, but moral injury is an injury of the soul. It's an injury of what we believe to be right and wrong with the world, and I explain it to veterans that it's when our compass that points to right, to correct, to good thinking, maybe. It either goes off by a few degrees or many, many degrees. And we start to think about things in a way that may not be entirely acceptable. And the experiences that we have changes us. Would that be an accurate sort of non-clinical description to veterans of moral injury?
Yeah, I think so. I really like the metaphor of the broken compass, the broken moral compass, as a way of capturing the experience of what it's like to be morally injured, to feel like, a person no longer has the capacity for moral decision making where they're going to be able to engage in intimate relationships, participate in socially sanctioned sources of meaning. Oftentimes, there's a profound sense that their basic sense of humanity has been somehow stripped away from them. If we're going to use metaphorical terms, I often, will use the metaphor of the Tin Man in The Wizard of Oz, that each of those characters is on a journey of sorts, and the Tin Man's journey is to recover his heart. So I think that many morally injured veterans, have that experience that somehow, their sacred beliefs and values, the things that really made life worth living, that there's just an empty place where those things used to be.
I really like that, and that's very interesting. But one of the things with the Tin Man is he noticed the loss and he longed for that hole to be filled.
Yep.
In my experience, veterans aren't really aware that that's even a thing. That's really that they're almost not certain, or they're not aware of the fact that they've lost that, or that hole exists. They know something's wrong, but they don't know that the heart is missing, and they don't go on that journey to retrieve that.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely, and I think that's why conversations like this one are so important. Just educating, veterans about the potential manifold consequences of serving in war, even if they don't necessarily meet criteria for a psychiatric disorder like post-traumatic stress disorder, or a medical disorder, which would be TBI in mild or moderate forms. Educating folks on, just the full continuum of challenges that can occur after war zone or military service.
And moral injury is one of those things that have emerged, I think, really, and probably now over the last 25 years, and obviously correct me if I'm wrong, but I believe with Jonathan Shea, of course, with Achilles in Vietnam, first developing that in the mid-'80s, and what he saw with veterans, Vietnam veterans coming back, and then with Dr. Litz and Shira Magwin and his work in sort of framing that, and then really what you're doing now. Can you talk a little bit about the emergence of the construct of moral injury?
Absolutely. you know, so I think you're absolutely correct that the construct of moral injury has really only recently gained the attention of behavioral scientists and mental health professionals. But this is really an ancient idea that has a long history in philosophy, in literature. So if you look at Jonathan Shea's Achilles in Vietnam, I mean, he was drawing his insights from the writings of Greek tragedies, to form his concept. But no, Jonathan Shea was the first one who really put the concept of moral injury on the map. Shea's definition of moral injury really tends to focus on the role of leadership malpractice, where there is a betrayal of what's right by someone who holds legitimate authority in a high stakes situation. So the focus is really on the experience of either witnessing or being the victim of kind of leadership's potentially moral acts of moral wrongdoing, and then the couple decades passed, and I think the real impetus for the revival of the concept of moral injury, it came in Litz and colleagues' seminal paper in 2009, but I think the real impetus for that was the prior 6 to 8 years, psychologists, mental health professionals, like yourself, working with returning veterans and really feeling like they were coming up short, really feeling like they weren't doing enough. And Litz's definition, it complements Shea's definition, but Litz's definition is more focused on what I might consider self-directed moral injury, trying to capture the unique emotional, social, spiritual consequences that can emerge when you yourself was the agent of potential moral wrongdoing, or you witnessed others commit these acts and you somehow hold yourself accountable for not limiting them in some way. There have been some recent definitions of moral injury that have come out, really over the last year. So there was a wonderful paper that was written by a couple friends of mine, Jake Farnsworth, Kent Drescher, Wyatt Evans, Robin Walzer, and they would define kind of moral injury as sort of the state of kind of engaging in unworkable or dysfunctional attempts to resolve moral pain. So what I like about this newer definition of moral injury is, it highlights the fact that for folks who are experiencing a moral injury, they may need to seek help. Their ways of coping are not helpful. They're not going to help them find their feet again, recover their heart, to use the metaphor of the Tin Man. But there's also a recognition as well that the experience of painful moral emotions like guilt and shame, having thoughts of personal responsibility, that considering just the hellish nature of war, that it makes sense that many of our veterans coming back, particularly those who were in really heavy combat situations, it makes sense that coming back, many of them are going to be experiencing a sense of moral pain, similar to grief after the loss of a significant loved one, and that we don't want to pathologize those moral responses.
Yeah, so it's really great, and I hear three very specific ways, and I get the sense that all of them are true, and these are different aspects to the same overall construct. Is the first the external betrayal of leadership or anything like that with Jonathan Shea. When I was in Iraq or Afghanistan, and we call them black routes, right? When routes were black, when the IED teams have not gone and cleared it, and there's a potential for danger, and yet we were still sent out on those routes. that many of my my soldiers or us, or we're just like, well, why are we here? Or are the people back in the rear just trying to get us killed? That kind of thing. We knew that wasn't true, but the sense was that there was this, we had to almost in some sense blame someone. So that's very accurate from an experiential standpoint in my, really in Iraq as much, and a little less in Afghanistan, but definitely in Iraq when I was there in 06, 07. And so that's when I talked to veterans about this. My buddy died and they're at fault. Somebody must be blamed and they're at fault because they sent us out on this route to... A perfect example is, as we're recording this, is the National Geographic episodes of The Long Road Home, where they were escorting sewage trucks. They sent me out here to escort sewage trucks, and now my buddy died, and they're to blame, or they're the and so there's this external thing that totally makes sense. But then there's the other piece of Brett Litz and his colleagues of the internal, I'm to blame. And so it's an internal blame thing. This is the one I hear often. My buddy, he and I swapped turrets, swapped vehicles, and he died. My vehicle went first, or we draw straws, and he went on the mission and I didn't, and that should have been me. And I see that very often. And then finally, this third one of, I have... Okay, so maybe I've recognized those two, but nothing I can do can overcome those feelings of guilt and shame.
Yeah, absolutely.
So, no, go ahead.
I was just, so I think, I think you're exactly right that, sort of use kind of the metaphor of the blind man and the elephant. I think, Jonathan Shea and Brett Litz and his colleagues, I think that they're highlighting, different dimensions that need to be, kind of acknowledged. So we need to be accounting for both these other directed and self-directed aspects of moral injury.
Now, and we're not, and I guess maybe we can get into examples of events that would cause moral injury. I
Sure.
see things on big scale. Of course, we talk about Abu Ghraib, or we talk about, back in Vietnam, the My Lai scandal, or in more recent times, I think it was 2011 or 2012, with the videos of the Marines, urinating on the remains of the enemy and things like that. I've had veterans, as we talk about this, and I use that last one specifically, where I have veterans that say, I don't condone what they did, but I've gotten to the place where I understand where they thought that was right. That's moral injury.
Yeah, absolutely.
So what other kind of things perhaps would be morally injurious in your experience to veterans?
Yeah, so, so in terms of self-directed events, or I think what many folks are calling kind of transgressive acts, in my experience, maybe many of these kind of lesser severe events, so obviously there's like the grand, kind of scale events like you're talking about, but even like kind of lesser severe events, mistreating civilians, being, too harsh with civilians, potentially damaging civilians' property unnecessarily, killing in combat, even, if it was done, for right reasons and within, clear rules of engagement. I think as time passes and veterans, reintegrate into civilian life, and, they're once again, kind of functioning within kind of cultural norms and mores in civilian culture, that they may then look back on, these very right actions in combat, and, an experience and moral pain may emerge for them gradually over time. I had a case, recently of a ranger who was, doing a raid, and they were, going through a house, and he was, I think he was coming in second. So he had, a pretty, so he kind of knew that he was going to potentially be the sitting duck, in this group. And, he heard a sound in the corner of the room, and everything appeared to be, quiet, but he heard a sound, and it was a young child who was, about 8 or 10 years old. And, he had to make, he had a fraction of a second to make a decision. And, this was, a region where they knew that there were, insurgents, that they knew that this was highly dangerous, where children were being used as weapons, and they were participating in, violent acts. And in that split second, he exercised restraint, and he did not pull the trigger on the kid. And it turns out the kid was not a threat. So he has incredible relief, right, that he didn't take this kid's life. But then years later, he looks back on this event, and he has guilt that he didn't pull the trigger,
right,
because he took the risk that maybe this kid would have had a weapon, and then he would have been responsible for the deaths of his close friends and comrades. So even that situation where the guy made, just a wonderful decision, can still be grounds for, can still serve as a transgressive act over time.
And that sounds a lot like meaning making, the meaning that we place on our events, the reason why, when, and we talk about this often, when rabbits run away, when they're, 500 yards away, that they're not worried about what happened, the reason why they run away. They don't retain that. Whereas we, as the evolved creatures, ruminate and make meaning and put reasons on. And like you said, it's almost like we can morally injure ourselves just through the meaning that we place on these events.
Absolutely. Yeah, absolutely. So I think it's really important, when we talk about moral injury, to make a distinction between potentially morally injurious events, okay, and the expressions or the possible symptoms of a moral injury. So in the same way, like when we talk about trauma, we talk about exposure to certain events, and then we talk about the development of post-traumatic stress disorder or other mental health conditions. I think we need to have the same precision when we talk about moral injury, because, Dwayne, you're exactly right. That these potentially morally injurious events occur all the time in the context of military service, right? It's just the nature of the work that we ask, our service members to do. But there are a series of intervening steps from exposure to a potentially morally injurious event and the state of becoming morally injured. And I think meaning-making, appraisal is one of the huge connecting pieces in this process. And that's where mental health professionals can actually play a key role in helping people to come to terms with these events in courageous but healthy ways that may not lead to the crystallization of moral injury over time.
Yeah, no, I really like how you said that there's this continuum of even the event, but then later on how we tell ourselves about the event. In Afghanistan in October 2009, our patrol got attacked, and we did lose one of our service members, a Sergeant Edviguez Wolf, and she died. But there were, and I say, just the random number, but there's 25, 30 people, myself included, who feel a very real responsibility for her death on one way, shape, or form. I'm the one that approved her to go on the patrol. My buddy who convinced me is the one who convinced me to allow her to go on the patrol. And so he and I, we've had this really, and so, everybody has, well, we're the reason, and we're holding 100% of the responsibility on ourselves. That's the meaning we make to that event, when the real responsibility is the insurgent who pulled the trigger. And so mental health professionals can help examine the validity of that belief of I'm responsible and assign and I have come to the terms with the fact that yes, I do bear a portion of the responsibility, but it's nowhere the magnitude where I originally had thought. And so I really like that how therapists, mental health professionals, understanding moral injury can help define that or discern that for the veteran.
Yes, and it becomes more complex clinically the more responsibility that a veteran should take in terms of the potentially morally injurious event that happened. So I think a mistake that many clinicians make, is that they attempt to alleviate or dismiss kind of guilt, or shame, over instances when, maybe a veteran really was culpable.
Right.
And it's ironic, but in my experience, veterans, who were potentially culpable or, who served as agents of trauma or violence on others, for reasons that maybe really were juxtaposed to the rules of engagement, that when they seek treatment, they don't want somebody who's going to explain away their actions. They want somebody who's going to help them to take responsibility and to really come to terms. So in a way, it's akin to a process of confession. That they want somebody, who's not going to, for lack of a better word, absolve their sins too quickly. They want to own them. They want to take responsibility for them.
And I think that really speaks to, we talk about the warrior ethos, but we're used to taking responsibility. Veterans are used to accepting responsibility for their actions. It's a key aspect of their nature.
Yeah, absolutely.
And so it would be disingenuous for them to even, somebody say, oh, you shouldn't feel guilty. Well, it doesn't change the fact that I do feel guilty, and I actually do have a measure of guilt around it. And so I really, that's a really important point. I appreciate that.
Yeah, absolutely. And, if you think about the action tendency that accompanies guilt, that we have the capacity to feel guilt for the purpose of making amends and making right that which has been damaged, whether it's hurting someone that we care about, that the capacity to feel guilt allows us to go and ask for forgiveness and to make amends. It gets complicated often, in cases of moral injury where there may not be a concrete way to make it right. And this is another way where mental health professionals can help to maybe make amends in different ways in the context of treatment.
And with Brett Litz in adaptive disclosure,
Yep.
this benevolent other, that's the concept of that intervention is for whatever these is having this, it's almost like a Gestalt-like conversation.
Dialogue. Yeah.
Right, with a benevolent other, and I've had that. I've worked with veterans to be able to say, okay, if your buddy who you feel responsible for, what would you say to them? How would they respond to you? You know them best, and things like that. And I can definitely see how that can help kind of evolve that. And so those are for the very, very big sort of morally injurious events. But what about the small clicks, right, on the compass? The way I kind of explain it is there's sort of a cumulative effect of our belief in changing right and wrong. I describe it as there are no stop signs in Afghanistan. There's no speed limits. There's no one-way streets. The one-way street is whichever way I'm driving. We would go, for safety reasons, security reasons, for expediency, wrong way around the traffic circle. Everybody stops and gets out of my way. Once you kind of, especially as an 18 or 19-year-old, realize that, hey, that's something that's possible. And if I work in this very, if it's not right to shove people out of the way, so to speak, or stop traffic and back it up. But now I have to come back to society where there are speed limits and rules and laws, and now I have to sit behind a little old lady at the checkout counter writing a check. Mm-hmm. Can that be morally injurious, sort of in a cumulative way?
Yeah, I think so. I think often, what happens for some morally injured vets, is that they come back and, they're needing to function within this different cultural moral system of right and wrong. And they look back and they can see this prior version of themselves acting very, 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 very differently. And for many, morally injured vets, I think it challenges their self-concept. It causes them to feel a sense of shame.
Right.
That, like a year ago, I was, I was driving like, a madman, or I was, if that little old lady was in front of me in the checkout line, I would have pushed her out of the way, or cussed at her, or treated her very disrespectfully. So looking back, I think coming back, I think many veterans, they sort of feel like a monster, because, they can look back on this prior version and realize that I have the capacity to live outside of the social contracts of society, that I have that capacity, that is in me. The reality is it's in all of us.
Right. It's just not awakened.
It's just not awakened, right? So, and veterans have experienced that. And, I think for many of them, it creates a sense of shame. It also creates a sense of fear of what they're capable of. So I think what drives avoidance in moral injury is often, in a sense, it's almost out of love that they're withdrawing from social relationships or socially sanctioned sources of meaning, because they're trying to protect the civilians.
Right.
Because they don't want to hurt anybody. They don't trust themselves. So I do think that, it can be the accumulation of these small, I like the metaphor that you use, ticks of the moral compass, that can really create problems over time.
And that's something, and I really like how you brought that out, that feeling of being a monster, and that's how we describe things, and I often explain to veterans, we take on the label of action. We may have done monstrous things, but that doesn't mean we're a monster. We may have done bad things, doesn't mean we're a bad person, but we put that on ourselves. I had a veteran, and as you and I originally came across, and so many of the listeners know, I work with justice-involved veterans. That's primarily the work that I do. I've been doing since 2014. And this veteran was in the justice program, and he's given me permission to freely share this. But he said that when he went in, this is his description, said, when I went into that valley, I thought that I was Captain America. A year later, I came out finding that I was Dr. Doom. He thought that he was this hero, that he was, he volunteered to go to Afghanistan. He was going to, it's just, it's some of it excitement, adventure, and really wild things, but also, truth, justice, and the American way. And he went into the valley, it's not to go too specifically into it, but, and it could be any of them, Fallujah, Ramadi, Korangal, the Arghandab, any, major Kunar province. And so he went in there thinking he was one thing, and then realized over that year that he had the capability of doing things that were monstrous, and he saw himself as evil. Mm-hmm. And yet then went back on a second tour to the same location, and so compounded it. So I really like how you brought that out. Oh, well, good. I'm glad. So, and that's a lot of the different things about moral injury. And just maybe for a little bit, how is it separate from PTSD? Because many people think that, well, isn't it all one and the same? But it is a very clear difference. My description is PTSD doesn't explain survivor's guilt, at least in my experience. The the negative cognitions assigned to a traumatic event, that doesn't explain survivor's guilt when you weren't faced with that. So could you talk a little bit about the difference between the two?
Yeah, so it's really important to highlight the fact that the diagnostic criteria, for PTSD has, again been expanded over recent years, where now PTSD is no longer conceptualized as an anxiety disorder, that PTSD, now finds itself in a new category of disorders called the trauma-related disorders. Historically, the diagnosis of, PTSD, emerged really for political reasons, not necessarily for out of really rigorous scientific research. Although I think we have learned through, scientific research over the last 30 or 40 years that, PTSD can be quite powerful, and it tends to be particularly debilitating. But we find ourselves at this point in time where PTSD has become something like a kitchen sink diagnosis, where it really seems to to go too far afield, and it seems to almost apply to everything. To the point where we can lose perspective that PTSD is really intended to be a mental illness, or a behavioral disorder of some sort. So when we talk about moral injury, I think it's really important to highlight that yes, kind of expressions of moral injury, the warning signs of a moral injury, that they do transcend the diagnostic criteria for PTSD, but they also overlap quite a bit. So for example, there's a lot of similarities in content with PTSD symptomatology. So for example, both moral injury and PTSD, they both are characterized by avoidance of memories or relationships, activities that are somehow reminiscent of the trauma. They both entail kind of maladaptive beliefs about the trauma. They both can entail strong, painful moral emotions. So one of the changes in the newest version of the criteria for PTSD is that the presence of persistent dysphoric emotion is now one of the symptoms. So guilt and shame can now be a symptom of PTSD, in the same way that guilt and shame can be a warning sign of a moral injury. Self-blame, social disconnection, emotional detachment, psychic numbing, these things cut across both. I think for me, as we think about like how to differentiate between PTSD and moral injury, for me as a clinician, it's more helpful to focus on the function of the symptoms rather than the content of the symptoms. So for example, behavioral avoidance be a key feature of either PTSD or moral injury. Why do folks engage in behavioral avoidance in the context of PTSD? Well, it's typically to avoid feeling anxious, to avoid having kind of that fight or flight mechanism triggered again, right? For folks that are engaging in avoidance in the context of moral injury, for them, it's going to be more about protecting others from being morally contaminated, trying to, somehow protect others from knowing about all the things that they've been through, that they don't want to taint others. They don't want to hurt others. So they may, show the very same symptom, but they may do it for different reasons.
No, I really like that, and not to, I didn't mean to interrupt you, but that's, I have this vision of two veterans, sitting on opposite ends of the diner, for example, have this, everybody stay away from me. One of them because they're afraid of interactions with others, the environment makes them anxious or things like that. And so it's I'm protecting myself from the environment, where the other veteran that is dealing more morally injurious, as you said, I'm protecting the environment from me. And that's a fine distinction that, to be honest, can't be done in a 20-minute, 30-minute evaluation. That takes time to really understand where that veteran's coming from.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. So you have these similarities, but there are some really important distinctions, ways that maybe, we can't really fully contextualize moral injury within the context of PTSD. At the level of events, potentially morally injurious events can occur in contiguous time and space with criterion A events for PTSD, but it's possible that other types of events might be appraised as morally injurious than the events that would be required to qualify as a criterion A stressor for PTSD. But as of right now, criterion A stressors for PTSD, they do not clearly account for acts of perpetration, right, or transgression. So this is one way that PTSD kind of falls short. And the research would suggest that that these acts of perpetration, that these transgressive acts, that they seem to have a particularly debilitating mental health impact compared to acts when one was potentially the victim or the witness. I think even if you look at criterion D criteria for PTSD, this would be kind of the new symptoms that have emerged. So negative trauma-related beliefs, expectation, cognitions. The criteria for PTSD, states that these need to be exaggerated or distorted attempts to make sense of the trauma. But, I think beliefs related to moral injury, that they tend to involve right and wrong, and they may not be distorted at all.
Yeah, they may be accurate.
They may be accurate. So I think that's really key. And then also, the strong negative beliefs in the context of PTSD, we've set up the diagnostic criteria in a way where they can be evaluated. So you can empirically address the belief that the world is not a safe place. Like, you can use cognitive restructuring, you can put that under a microscope, you can generate evidence for against that belief. But for folks, who are struggling with moral injury, they may be struggling with that belief, but they might be struggling with the belief the world should be a safe place. That I know the world is safe, but you know what? There's something inside of me that says this isn't the way the world is supposed to be. So there's a distinction, between descriptive and prescriptive cognitions. And, I think that PTSD is really effective at capturing the descriptive cognitions, whereas I think people who are struggling with moral injury tend to be struggling more with the prescriptive cognitions, more like the thoughts about like what the world should be like. So thinking about a veteran who might be experiencing both PTSD and moral injury after they put their life on the line for potentially 3, 4, 5, 6 deployments, and now they're really struggling from a mental health standpoint, and they look back on this younger version of themselves and they just have this sense that I shouldn't be struggling this way. This was not what I signed up for. Mm-hmm. Right? And that can bring about a sense of moral injury too.
And so in dealing with or addressing post-traumatic stress disorder differently than moral injury or some of these other concepts I've been talking about on other episodes, there's different interventions that mental health providers would use. EMDR works excellent with very clear post-traumatic stress disorder, the traumatic stress reaction of a criterion A event. Prolonged exposure, if it's only just PTSD, that works very well. And that's what I'm trying to get across to mental health professionals who may be listening is, you need to use the right tool for, the task that's in front of you. And if you think it's PTSD and you're using prolonged exposure, but it really has more of the prescriptive description of morally injurious event, that's totally different kind of intervention that's used.
Yeah, absolutely. So obviously this is the $1 million, maybe $1 billion question. What treatment approaches are going to be most effective for addressing moral injury? How do we need to adapt existing evidence-based interventions for PTSD to address moral injury? So there are a number of groups across the country that are really leading the way in this work, and these groups seem to be taking kind of two basic approaches. So there are some groups who are attempting to take evidence-based interventions. I mean, it could be EMDR, it could be prolonged exposure, it could be cognitive processing therapy. So they're taking kind of the bones of that intervention, and then they're attempting to adapt it to also address issues of moral injury. And then you have some groups, like Brett Litz's group, who are developing novel interventions. So I mean, the components of their intervention are not novel, but the packaging and the ordering of their interventions are novel. It seems like the folks that are taking the novel approaches are really, in my view, doing a superior job incorporating interventions that are going to promote in-the-moment processing of painful moral emotion. So, I think you can get at, the resolution of guilt or shame in the context of imaginal exposure, okay? But I think that you're only going to be able to get your veteran patient to a certain point in time. I think you need to be able to incorporate additional interventions, that are going to move them toward forgiveness of self, forgiveness of others. And so what's happening is you see Litz's crew, you see Shira McGeen, she's developed an intervention, to help veterans heal from kind of persisting trauma-related symptoms related to acts of killing in war. So what you see them doing is they're incorporating events that really, had their early roots in the Gestalt, in the humanistic therapy tradition. Right. They're using these imaginal dialogues, whether in the form of a chair intervention in session, or they're using, a varied version of them, where the focus is on writing or journaling. But essentially what's happening here is you're helping the person to, promote dialogue within themselves to resolve this inner conflict. And in my experience clinically, these kind of in-the-moment processing of emotion interventions that, really these are the interventions that form the basis for emotion-focused therapy, Les Greenberg's work. They hold tremendous promise for addressing moral injury. There are some folks that are really doing a good job modifying acceptance and commitment therapy to addressing moral injury. So ACT has a focus on clarification of values, living in accordance with values, reclaiming values. I think the values work in ACT lends itself really well to helping morally injured vets heal as well.
So, and that's some really great points, and I'll make sure to get connections to all that in the show notes. But also one of the important things is to determine whether there is moral injury in the first place, and that speaks to your work with the assessments and how do you assess moral injury separately from post-traumatic stress disorder. You want to talk about that for a few minutes?
Absolutely. I guess in terms of the contribution of my work, I've been much more focused on assessment than intervention. I'm kind of sitting back, allowing colleagues to do the heavy work in terms of intervention development and evaluation of interventions. But we have, made pretty good progress, in the area of assessing, moral injury. So right now, there would be two psychometrically available instruments to capture exposure to potentially morally injurious events. Bill Nash, Brett Litz, they have a measure called the Moral Injury Event Scale. It's a 9-item measure. It's pretty helpful for assessing kind of the presence of events that where the veteran may believe that they transgressed, where they were the potential victim of betrayal. And then we have the Moral Injury Questionnaire, which is supposed to be an exposure-specific measure that myself and colleagues, Kent Drescher and others, developed. And this measure assesses the exposure to a fuller range of specific potentially morally injurious events. And we've talked about many of these. More recently, over recent years, my team has worked to develop a tool for assessing the expressions of a moral injury. So earlier we made a distinction between events and expressions. So to continue to make that distinction, we have a couple good tools for assessing events. Now, we have a tool. Actually, I'm excited to say that our article was accepted for publication last week, so I can now speak freely about our scale that we've passed peer review. But we've developed. It's a 17-item version that captures both self-directed expressions of moral injury and other directed expressions of moral injury. If I were to incorporate these measures in my own clinical practice, which I do, I would tend to use them alongside conventional exposure measures. So I would want to get a full picture of all of the different potential traumas that my patient had experienced. And then I would also use we call it the expressions of moral injury scale. I would use that alongside other conventional mental health symptom measures. So I tend to like the measures the VA endorses, the PCL5 and the PHQ-8. These would be measures of PTSD symptoms and depressive symptoms. What we have found in our research is that our measure of moral injury expressions tends to overlap quite a bit with symptomatology of PTSD and depression, but it does tend to add something unique to the clinical picture that isn't being captured in the diagnostic criteria for PTSD and major depression.
And that sounds like it's really, tuning the focus of the lens. Essentially what we were talking about earlier is helping clinicians discern a little bit more about what actually we're addressing right here. And so I find that very beneficial. As I mentioned, one of the first reasons, or the first reason I reached out to you, was my questions about the military moral injury questionnaire, military version, the MIQM. In my clinical work, maybe this might be beneficial for you, is I find the moral injury event scale good for more of a broad range if it's not combat focused. So I have veterans, maybe Cold War era veterans who may not have engaged in combat. They respond much more to the moral injury event scale versus combat veterans that it fine tunes for your assessment. So I use them both interchangeably in the different context.
I think that makes a lot of sense. And, so if there was a clinician out there that really wanted to get at a measure that's going to capture, exposure to potentially morally injurious events that happened outside of the context of combat, in some ways, maybe our moral injury questionnaire might be a little limited because we did craft those items with an eye toward what might be considered war zone traumas.
Yeah, and I found that in actual practice, and so it's out in the field that very much, and they both work, and it's just more tools in the toolbox for the clinician to be able to say that. I remember very clearly I was conducting an assessment for the courts where I had both, and I showed it to the veteran, the MIQM to the veteran. He was like, yeah, this wasn't really a thing for me. But when I showed it the MIES, he was like, oh yeah, and then he started going on. And his had much more to do with what you talked about, or what we talked about at the very beginning: toxic leadership betrayal, a lot more of that very early, Jonathan Shea looking at that. That was much more of his concern, and not so much more the transgressive acts. And so, yeah.
I think a really good question, for clinicians to make sure that they ask veterans. I think it's helpful to give these assessment instruments to just get a comprehensive, objective picture of all of the significant events that the veteran has experienced. And I think by adding the moral injury event scales, essentially what you're doing is you're sending the message very early on that you want to expand the conversation, that you're comfortable talking about these things, that you want to understand these events. And then once you have that information, I think a really helpful question is just to ask the veteran, which of these causes the most pain for you today? Or which of these events haunts you the most today? And then to give the veteran the freedom to identify, the event or the events that are at the center of their pain. And to not assume that every single veteran is going to identify a potentially morally injurious event. There might be many that do, but there might be others who have other types of potential military traumas that they're going to address.
Right, and that's where I've taken to using this conceptualization as we're going through this series to walk through a veteran in each of these, and it addresses substance abuse, emotional dysregulation, separate from PTSD, and it kind of goes through all these, and it's been able to help. I have a veteran, who says, yeah, I've gone to the PTSD program, I've got that piece, but things are still out of whack for me. And in the discussion, it was really much more of the Viktor Frankl, the purpose and meaning was his concern. Is that aspect of his post-military life hadn't been addressed, and so I like this to be able to just discern really what we're doing. Joe, I think we could talk about this stuff all day, and I really appreciate your time. I think this is really going to help both the veterans who listen to this understand about moral injury, but also maybe their family members and definitely clinicians. So before we wrap up, how can listeners learn more about what you're doing? How can they reach out to you?
Email is the best way to reach me. My email address is jcurrier, Currier, at southalabama.edu. You can also find me on my faculty page for the University of South Alabama website. Send me an email. I'll be glad to share any of these resources with anybody that's trying to help veterans.
Yeah, I'll make sure to get all of those in the show notes, and we'll do a recap here in a bit and make sure that everybody has that information. Any last thing that you'd like to talk about real quick?
No, I just really appreciated this conversation this morning, and I'm grateful for the work that you're doing, Dwayne.
No, I'm grateful for the work that you're doing, because this is a big aspect of something that's not really out there, and both on the academic side and the clinical side, really all of us sort of pulling levers where we're at is the way that we're going to get something done. And hopefully, like we said at the very beginning, you and I can go be fishing guides somewhere or something.
Oh, that would be great.
Okay, thank you very much, and look forward to hearing more from you in the future.
All right, sounds good.
Hard work, hard work, hard work.
So we just got done listening to a great episode with Dr. Joseph Currier talking about moral injury. You can find the show notes on this show and many of the things we talked about at either changeyourpov.com or veteranmentalhealth.com, looking for episode HST033. This is the 9th episode of Veteran Mental Health Bootcamp, a series brought to you by Change Your POV Podcast Network and the Headspace and Timing Podcast.
Got to go make the call. Banging on the doors in the morning.
If you're a veteran or service member, the family member of one, or support veterans in any way, then this series is designed to help you understand more about veteran mental health.
Hard work, manifest. Hard work, you gotta do it right. Hard work, and here we go.
If you're just now getting into the series, go back and check out episode HST025, where we introduce the concept of looking beyond PTSD and TBI in regards to veteran mental health.
Work, we're moving on out. We gotta go and do the job. Load 'em up on the airplane. In the early morning rain. Hard work. That's what
Make sure you subscribe to the Change Your POV Podcast Network on your podcast player of choice, and sign up for updates at changeyourpov.com and veteranmentalhealth.com.
fired up. Hard work. Everybody on the plane. Hard work. Gotta sit 'em on down. Hard work.
We would love to hear your feedback regarding this series and all of the shows in the Change Your POV Podcast Network. You can do so by visiting our Facebook group, leaving a comment, or review on iTunes.
Hard work. I earn my pay. Hard work. We're on the hard work.
Remember, veteran mental health and wellness is the basis of a successful post-military life, and one that all who answered our nation's call to serve deserves. Remember, brothers and sisters, you're not alone. Ever.
That's what